The World Tomorrow. For over 7 decades, Herbert W. Armstrong and his son Garner Ted Armstrong led thousands into a better understanding of biblical truths. Their work still has a profound effect on a great number of people all over the world. And now, the Church of God Worldwide Ministries presents The World Tomorrow. The Church of God Worldwide Ministries is dedicated to bring you the truth from the Word of God, how current world events relates to Bible prophecy, and preach the good news of the coming kingdom of God and the world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, today's presenter, Bruce Horn.
Greetings, friends, wherever you may be around the world. This is Bruce Horn with the good news of the world tomorrow. My friends, it is an enduring part of the American mythos that the United States was founded to provide liberty and justice for all. But is that true? We want to believe it's true. It is codified in our law, is it not? And it is enshrined in our founding documents, emblazoned on public and other buildings. Again, it is part and parcel of the American meme, if I may use that term, that we are a nation of freedom. Well, I want to read the beginning of the Declaration of Independence to you, and then I'm going to follow that with another very famous speech made by an American president in 1863. Some of you already know to what I'm referring. But after I have read these excerpts, I then want to discuss with you the fact that these freedoms were not initially made available to all, and that has set the stage for some very serious problems that we're facing today. But now from the Declaration of Independence, Mr. Jefferson's soaring, transcendent thoughts and words, here we go. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now that's in the Declaration of Independence, the first premise, that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the second major premise of these two opening sections of the Declaration, that when the government becomes the enemy of the people, when it no longer meets the goals and expectations of the people, the promises that it has made to the people, that it is the duty of the people to overthrow that government and to replace it with one more amenable to the people's will and to their hoped-for ends. Now, that's a mouthful, isn't it? But let me continue. November 19th, 1863, the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg has just been fought in the war between the states, and the North gained the military victory, to be sure. And so President Lincoln, standing there to dedicate the cemetery, basically, on the battlefield at Gettysburg, after a 2-hour oration by America's most famous orator, Edward Everett, then uttered his own immortal speech. Who remembers what Edward Everett said that day? Again, speaking for over 2 hours. But every schoolboy and schoolgirl learns the Declaration of Independence. I'll never forget, in the 7th grade, we memorized the Gettysburg Address. I believe I said Declaration of Independence, but if I did, forgive the miscue. We memorized the Gettysburg Address, and I could recite it verbatim, no mistakes. I made 100 on that particular assignment. Now I think I'll read it rather than trust my memory. About 10 sentences, fewer than 300 words, but listen to this. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That same theme, reiterated, the same theme from Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence. Now, let me continue. Lincoln says, "Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Noble sentiments. It sounds good. But the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, of that same time period, only freed the slaves in the Confederate states, the states allegedly in rebellion against the federal government. It did not free the slaves elsewhere in the country. And it's a misconception, my friends, when people believe that slavery was peculiar to the South, to the Confederacy, and not to the entire nation. Some of the worst abuses during the whole period of slavery actually occurred in the North. Did you know that? And so when Lincoln gave his speech on the field at Gettysburg, following that terrific, bloody battle, did that heal the wounds of the nation? Did it bind them together? Well, it was intended to help effect that. But again, he's talking about all men being created equal, just as Jefferson discussed that same noble concept. And yet, think of that founding document, the Declaration of Independence, and then think of the Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution, and think of the Constitution, and think of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, enacted in 1791 and collectively called the Bill of Rights. Did you know that the guarantees of freedom under the Declaration of Independence and under the Constitution and spoken of by Lincoln did not apply to everyone? No, not at all. When the Declaration of Independence was written, for example, those unalienable rights basically pertained to white, male, landowners. Ladies, I'm sorry, that pretty well leaves you out, at least during that period of time. And what of Native Americans, Indians, in other words? And now, they didn't call themselves Indians. They called themselves Cherokee and Iroquois and Comanche and Apache and Pueblo, Sioux, and all the rest. Did the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution guarantee them the same rights it guaranteed white male landowners? It did not. And what about blacks? What about those individuals, called Negroes at the time, who had been brought to this continent against their will, beginning in the early 1500s when the Spaniards brought the first Africans here as slaves? And don't blame it all on the European colonizers, because even within Africa itself, nation rose against nation, black brother against black brother, capturing one another and selling each other into slavery to the white man. That was the crucible in which our nation truly was founded. We like to present ourselves with a sanitized version of our history, and we trot out the founding documents and all of the noble sentiments and all of the rhetoric and all of the oratory and all of the wonderful things that we have used to try to convince the world, and particularly ourselves, lo, these 200 plus years, that we really are all about freedom, and we tell ourselves that, but it has been selective freedom, and that's just the truth of the matter. And the war between the states was not primarily fought over slavery. Did you know that? Oh, the history of this country is so fascinating and so unknown. I want you to call or write for this free booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. You may write to us at The World Tomorrow, 1965 Chapman Highway, Sevierville, Tennessee, 37876, or call us at 1-865-774-4600, or go to the web, cogwwm.org, and order this free booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. There will be no follow-up, no request for money, but this booklet will give you insights into the history of this nation that will, to use the modern expression, blow your mind. It really will. It's going to open your eyes to things that you've never known, never thought about before. Call for it. Write for it. You need it. I'll advertise it again before the close of the program. So if the war between the states was not fought to abolish slavery, people are thinking now of abolitionists and the Dred Scott decision and all of the rest that led up to that terrible conflict, the secession of South Carolina as the first of the southern states to secede. I'm thinking early 1861, and the beginning of the actual shooting war in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. I've been there, been actually at the fort site itself. Lots of history there. Well, what was the war about? States' rights. But you see, people want to frame it in other contexts, and one of the great risks, one of the great fears that we all should have is that this can devolve into race war, into the idea that one race is pitted against another. After the Northern military victory at the close of the war between the states, some call it the Civil War, call it that if you prefer, and the signing of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Most people are familiar with portraits and the famous scene of Confederate General Commander-in-Chief Robert E. Lee signing the surrender, and the Northern commander Ulysses S. Grant, later President Ulysses S. Grant, was there to accept the surrender. Very amicable setting, and actually it was. Both Grant and Lee were true gentlemen, cultured men of the times. They were not personally hostile toward each other. The animosities were not on that level. The animosities were much deeper and more global. The animosities were between groups and factions and ideologies more, at least in the case of Grant and Lee, than between individuals. But of course, in that bloody conflict, America's bloodiest war, where over 600,000 casualties occurred, brother was pitted against brother, family against family. Oftentimes the demarcation between the North and the South, we're all familiar with the famous Mason-Dixon line, but it wasn't quite that simple. Sometimes the dividing line between the Yankees and the rebels was vague, and it was in flux, and it might run halfway down this neighborhood and then up the main street of that town, and it was a terrible, terrible time. But the ideologies were so strong, the hatreds, not again necessarily between the individuals, but between the causes, were so deeply entrenched that this war took on a terrible, bloody life of its own. And for over 4 terrible years, this country was divided. And it hasn't been the same since. And that's another story for another time, but I will tell you this much.